Proverbs chapter 22, Discipline. I can't help feeling this chapter was written with the current pandemic in mind, preparing us for all the problems we face today. Verse 15, the cure comes from tough-minded discipline. Almost every verse in this chapter has wisdom for our current situation. Wisdom which comes from the accumulated insight of God's people over generations. We've learnt again to look out for trouble, potentially infectious situations, to see it coming and duck, as it says in verse 3, whilst others travel a dangerous road, potholed and mud-slick. If we know what's good for us, we stay clear of it. That's from verse 5. We've learnt all too well how young people cope with the pandemic situation. Young people are prone to foolishness and fads, says verse 15. The cure comes through tough-minded discipline. And that's a challenge to parents, isn't it? Good discipline is always difficult when we bring up our children. How do we make sure they do the right things without really hurting them or damaging them? Ironically, the last section of this chapter in this Bible version, the Message, is entitled The 30 Precepts of the Sages. Was that written with tongue-in-cheek for today's world of scientific advice and the renowned Sage Committee? There follows good advice and a list of do's and don'ts, mostly don'ts. Where have I heard that one before? But God's wisdom is worth giving careful attention to. Ultimately, when we trust its author, we will find guidelines for living that really work. They come from a reliable source and have been tested by generations. Truths that work. So here are some of the don'ts from verses 22 to 29. Don't walk on the poor just because they are poor. Don't hang out with angry people. Bad temper is just contagious. Don't gamble on a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, or a moonshot, or a perfect vaccine. Don't steadily move back the boundary lines. Perhaps that's most of all, important of all. We all find it easy to push back at restrictions we find difficulty in following, whether it's rules for good living or diets of COVID guidelines. And finally, at the end, a do. Observe people who are good at their work or lead honest and humble lives following God, who provide us with models well worth copying. Proverbs has so many messages for us today, even in the most contemporary situations, especially with the COVID-19 virus threats.